Hi and welcome to Rethinking Education, the series of videos where I talk to some of the most interesting voices in education to get their ideas on teaching and learning. I'm Dom Traynor, I'm the Education Evangelist at Adobe for Europe, Middle East and Africa, and in today's talk I'll be talking to Bill Lucas, Professor at the University of Winchester, Professor of Learning at the University of Winchester and Director of the Centre for Real World Learning. Hi Bill, how are you doing?
I'm good. Hi, Dom.
Now, tell me a little bit about, a day in the life of Bill Lucas, because, Professor of Learning and Director. I didn't actually know this second one. I'm reading off a sheet because I didn't actually know it. Director of the Centre for Real World Learning. What's all that about?
Well, the Centre for Real World Learning, as its name suggests, is interested in all the learning that we do throughout our life. I mean, that is the real world. It just happens that when you're at school, that is a huge part of your real world. So obviously we're interested in school and how young people learn, but we're equally interested in the kinds of dispositions and habits of mind that will help an adult learner throughout his or her life. And the glorious thing about my role, Dom, is that there is no such thing as a typical day. And that applies whether we're in lockdown, which we've just sort of easing our way out of, or at a time when I was privileged to be traveling probably slightly too much across the world, working with amazing people. But there are some themes, and the themes are, I'm really interested in things that don't quite fit into our conventional understanding of a school and its timetable. And I'm interested in things that historically we've always known mattered. We may come on and talk about these, character, creativity, and all the rest of it, about which there's some debate or even argumentation. And in some cases, and I would say sadly, in some parts of England, there's still some political opposition.
I think we're quite aligned on this idea, of creativity and why it's important. But can you give us an idea, just in a nutshell, things like, creativity and, character and critical thinking, all of those big C skills that are getting so much more airtime at the moment. Why are they important? What is your perspective on that?
Well, they've always been important, and that's worth saying, because good educators and families who've cared about these things have always known they matter. But there's been an interesting drift in education, I think, as we've found out more and more and more. So human creativity and ingenuity is astonishing. So we invent the Hadron Collider, we come up with a vaccine, several vaccines for this incredibly awful pandemic within months. Extraordinary creativity, engineering, collaboration, critical thinking, all the things that matter. And suddenly you realize that whilst, of course, it's hugely important that we have young people who love maths or who love science or love dancing or love physical education, all that's really, really important. And this is not an either or. All these other things are as important. And if there were a whatever those things are, seesaw, we've kind of gone like that. And we're irritatingly, in my perspective, we've entered a time when the tip is too much towards things that might be described as knowledge, not always powerful and interesting and useful knowledge, and quite often knowledge that is relatively easy to transmit or share, and also relatively easy to assess, and much less interest shown in how you might use it, back to this title of my centre, in the real world, or how you might apply it, or how you might work across disciplines from one to the other. So the simple answer, Dom, is it's always been important, but it's never been more important now. And some curricula across the world are acknowledging this, a huge number actually. The last time that the Brookings Institution looked at this, they found that more than 50 countries in their national curricula are starting to have these kind of things as mandated. And I know we'll come on to talk about that. So there's a drift towards this, but it's not always entirely supported across England. Interestingly, if you step back from England to the United Kingdom,
Mm.
there has been huge interest in creativity and other things like that. In Scotland, the Scottish Curriculum for Excellence has had this pretty mainstream for the last 5, 6, 7 years. In Northern Ireland, it's never disappeared, although their educational system is different. It still has selective education. And in Wales, the new Welsh National Curriculum puts these kind of things stage centre. So, within the United Kingdom, England is a bit of an outlier. And those of us who care about this are keen to find thoughtful ways of overcoming that.
It is very interesting. I'm doing a lot of work with Welsh schools, and I'm seeing that difference between England and Wales. But one of the things that I find really interesting is, if we look at, data from the World Economic Forum or LinkedIn or the PricewaterhouseCoopers CEO survey, anything like that, all of the people who are creating, jobs or working in industry, they're all asking for all of these skills that you are a huge advocate of. And yet, we might have Scotland, we might have Wales, we might have Northern Ireland, going in the right direction. How is it that England has gone in the wrong direction?
Yeah, a good question. I've recently been part of the Durham Commission on Creativity in Education, and in our first report, we try to outline the kind of case or cases that you've been making there. And broadly speaking, they are the following, that there's a demand side pressure here. So the World Economic Forum, the OECD, Adobe in its work on the state of creativity, many small, medium and large businesses across the world, international organization UNESCO, for example, after another, all saying we really need these kind of things for employability, for success beyond school. So that's argument number one. Number two is that actually many of these things are so close to who we are, so close to identity, and a significant part of our well-being. And if we look at where UK young people sit in that, it's not great, whether you're looking at UNESCO data or PISA data or Children's Society data. And so creativity and Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi and his wonderful work on the state of flow is a really obvious example that most of your watchers and listeners to this would immediately relate to, that when you're really using your creativity and you're utterly absorbed and engaged in something, it's really satisfying. And unsurprisingly, it makes you feel better. That's the second argument. The third argument is that creativity, which was a contested subject, think back 20 years, the late wonderful Sir Ken Robinson and his report in 1999, All Our Futures, really had to lay out a case for creativity and offer a definition. And since then, in the last 2 decades, scholars and practitioners across the world have said, actually, this makes sense. And it also makes sense in an educational domain. And most recently, this is the third case, organizations like PISA have said, not only does this make sense, and we know it's valuable, but we believe we should assess it. And there's something about the gauging of importance in schools that sometimes, sadly, I think, is very much related to what is assessed. I know you were a teacher, Dom, so you recognize this, that with the best will in mind, it's inevitably the case that teachers who want to do their best for the kids in their care will have one eye on the exam, and so they should. But so we'll talk about that later, I know. But 3 really powerful reasons why these things matter. And the fourth is a kind of more existential one, and is that as we talk to each other now in 2020, who on earth would have predicted what we've just been through in the last year? Who has the foggiest what's going to be happening in the next decade? Anyone who says they know exactly what we need to know or precisely which skills for the next decade, never mind the rest of the century, is to be disbelieved, because we don't. And what we do know is that some of these skills, like creativity and critical thinking and effective problem solving and being able to keep going when you really find something difficult, these are timeless, and they're the kind of superpowered habits or attributes which will really help us thrive in uncertain times. So there's that kind of uncertainty argument, which I think
Mm.
this year I found more and more compelling.
You talking about those things and thinking about, you know, if anybody thinks that they know what is going to be valuable in the next, you know, 10 or 20 years or whatever, you know, is to be disbelieved. And but you go back to those ideas of you know, creativity, critical thinking, and communication, all of these kind of as timeless skills, which we're not necessarily assessing in schools. And so we're kind of looking at assessments as this almost like this keystone, aren't we? This is the thing that seems to be tying everybody together. And it's because when you know, if it, you know, people are listening out there, you know, when their child is at school, the reason why everything happens is because everything's focused on that central piece of assessment. So I know that that's one of the things that you're looking to tackle now. You're part of this kind of, you know, Alma Conville called it a coalition, which is Rethinking Assessment. So, you know, tell us a little bit about why is this kind of Rethinking Assessment movement started? You know, and how has it gathered so much pace?
Well, partly for the reasons that you imply, that there's a dissatisfaction with the status quo. I mean, I think it's been really helpful for us that one of our members is Lord Baker, Ken Baker, who was the architect of GCSE.
Mm-hmm.
And when a very senior Conservative politician from the House of Lords says, this thing I came up with is no longer fit for purpose, then it's quite difficult for colleagues on his side of the House, but also more broadly the press, not to take notice. So, I mean, the reasons for our dissatisfaction are many, but would include at its heart the fact that GCSE, especially if this is an English audience listening, but many of the 16 plus tests across the world tend to test a narrow part of what it is to be talented. And there are all sorts of reasons why that might be, but that's the
I've never heard it put in that way. So assess ways in which you are talented. That is that's a very nice way of putting it.
Yeah, and that's what we're about. So we want to create a world in which more of what it is to be talented is acknowledged. We don't like the fact that, and Alma Conville and Peter Hyman, both with me, part of the original group creating this movement, would talk in some way about head, heart, and hand, and that we need all of them, and that education loves to focus on the head. And we'd really like to find a way of acknowledging development in the two other areas that make us up as human beings. So there's something about it doesn't test the whole thing. Then at the other end of the spectrum, there's something ludicrous, I think, and Jeff Barton, one of our members, the General Secretary of ASCL, makes this case very, very cogently. It is bonkers to have a test that 1/3 of the testees fail. I mean, who would buy a mobile phone that only made 2 out of 3 calls successfully, or a Zoom call that we're on now? I mean, they're 99 point something %. They do go wrong, or your internet drops off. So there's something silly about that. But when you think about the third who fail, there's something immoral about that. If you have an exam that means that in many cases, the least well off, the least able to fend for themselves will know at 16 that they're a failure. I don't want to be part of that system. I think it stinks. So I really, that's the hard edge of this. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in between is a frustration that we still want to examine our children on one hot afternoon. So everything you've done up until the age of 16 in English literature will test you on 1 or maybe 2 hot afternoons or mornings in the summer if you're in England. That seems to be very, very odd, and that's going to be a pencil and paper type test when there are so many other sophisticated ways of doing that. It also, because of the choice of subjects, especially in England, especially at 16 plus, and especially with the external accountability that Ofsted bring to this, where Progress 8 and Attainment 8 scores really count and head teachers' livelihoods depend on them, it means that we skew the curriculum towards a smaller number of so-called high-status, so-called academic subjects. And I don't like that either. I think that's a
And this is
a
the
very
hot
odd
housing,
way of
isn't it?
going about it.
Mm.
And you know, we were talking earlier, Dom, about all the things that employers want. Well, where are they then? Why aren't they being assessed? Well, you could say because kids won't go into employment immediately, and that's true. 16 plus examining is a legacy of a period where that was the end of compulsory schooling, and we've just let it run. Kids now stay in school until 18, and if they're not in school, they're in college or doing apprenticeship, but they're still in full-time education, albeit with a vocational spin. So there's something weird that the very things that the rest of the world says they're interested in, and if you go on and get a job in Adobe or in Google or PricewaterhouseCoopers or any of the regional businesses I think of, or not-for-profits, or frankly in other sectors, other government sectors, you need these things, and they're absolutely invisible for your school life up to, and probably in many schools' cases, until you get to 18, 19 and you leave. Now, there are a few examples in the A-level period or the level 3 period, and the extended project qualification is a really good example of a serious attempt to capture more than the kind of things I've been talking about. And just finally, I could go on a long time, as you can maybe sense, about why they're not fit for purpose. This I should gladden your heart, given your interest in technology. It seems to me very, very strange that we're not making use of technology when in our other lives, when I choose to go out for a jog, I might be using Strava or Fitbit, and I'd be getting assessment feedback on my performance. I'd be able to set personal targets. I'd be able to see when I ran that bit last time, was it faster or slower this time? I'm getting exactly what assessment is really about. Assessment is not a kind of external scrutiny exercise. Assessment, or the true purpose of assessment, is helping learners figure out how close they're getting to where they want to get to. And then with their teachers or skilled peers, people who are more further down the line, figuring out what they could do differently so that they could acquire this knowledge or that skill or that mindset.
So one of the things that you were talking about there before was how, head teachers' livelihoods depend on it. And I think, that is a, not just head teachers, teachers, heads of departments, everyone down to a teaching assistant, their lives depend on it, don't they? Well, that's at least how they feel. And a lot of them will obviously feel like that is a yearly cycle that they are kind of subject to. They'll find that really, really difficult to get out of that loop. So maybe one of the things that we could do is talk about what's working elsewhere, in order to give people a little bit of relief and sort of hope that actually other people are doing it differently and this is how they do it. What have you seen on a global level? Where have you seen good examples of this kind of assessment or just education in general?
I think there are clusters of different kinds of approaches. I'll try and summarize these for you. I'll stick with where we got to, which was the use of technology. And I think one of the things that I find most exciting at the moment is the way that schools are inviting learners, especially at secondary level, to take more control over their progress. The word sometimes used is agency. It means different things to different people. But I think it's really important that, and here's how you might do it. So, for example, a school that I've worked with very closely in Australia, in Sydney, Rooty Hill High School, each student there has a digital portfolio. And on that portfolio, they would keep, I use that word digitally, they would store, they would curate examples of the things that they're doing and the things that show progress in that. And sometimes they would go outside school and they'd use a photograph or a testimonial or an interview maybe. Sometimes there'll be cross-checking with staff within school. So there's a sort of validate function, very simple, because the difference between this and the single mark that you get in an exam is that it's multi-headed. So there are lots of different ways in which we can get a sense of the data. Although some people used to say that portfolio, well, you could cheat, couldn't you? Or you could game that system. Actually, it's incredibly difficult to game that system because you have far more useful, relevant information about a student and their learning and their progress and their values and their aspirations than you would from a single grade. So there's the portfolio, increasingly digital. A little element of the portfolio is the movement that's sometimes described as digital badging or digital badges.
Yeah.
Think Girl Guides and Scouts or any of the uniform groups who might have had a mum or dad stitching onto your shoulder the
I remember it
camping
very well.
badge. Yeah, you remember that well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Both of my youngest children are really active in that. And that just gives you, at a much more discreet level, a simple statement that says, this person has been through these experiences and gained these capabilities. And so you can see
it's really interesting
how,
when you do that, isn't it? Because actually, when you look at that, when digital badging came in, people were kind of like, some people really jumped on it, and other people were very skeptical and like, oh, this is nonsense. What's all this about? But actually, that's a really traditional route of assessment.
We never said it was nonsense when it was being done before technology. It's just the kind of same people who say some of this is nonsense may have fixed mindset views about appropriate use of technology. I'm the last person to overclaim for the use of technology, but this whole the kind of platform, in the corporate world, the expression might be balanced scorecard. The portfolio notion really comes from architecture and engineering design, where you'd recognize that the way you'd show your kind of capability would probably be in drawings and sketches and artifacts, and that those couldn't be reduced to a mark. So there's that portfolio idea, which is sort of going broad, I think, and that would be its characteristic. And then there's another approach here, which is going vertical or going narrative, and that you can see a lot of in the States at the moment. And a really good example of it is the Mastery Transcript Consortium, which is a group of high schools and universities who are recognizing that what you really want to get is a rich narrative story about this person. You will need some standardized test results, and different countries and different states are deciding what those kind of things need to be. And they're probably going to be something, actually, as the World Economic Forum suggests, something in the foundational literacies and probably something in science. And then you can discuss what else you might have. But as well as that, you're going to get more of what you do when you grow up. And you have that thing called a curriculum vitae, which is essentially, literally, the story of my life.
Of course.
And when you apply to university, if that's the route you're going, you write a personal statement. And that was a good idea. I think it's become an idea that's so gameable these days that there's almost a kind of phrase bank of sentences that pop out of students' minds there, and that maybe has devalued it. But this idea of a transcript suggests much more detail, much more attention to detail, third-party corroboration of claims. So it's a much richer idea, and that's happening apace in the States. There's a general movement there. Some schools in England are part of that. A third strand is sort of real-world performance. So a different kind of performance where the tests that you're putting your students through aren't just paper and pencil, that you might be encouraging students to exhibit their work or to give presentations. So you're looking at their, just like you might at higher level, higher education, where you have a viva. So you're valuing oracy as well as literacy, or the written part of literacy. Or it might be a performance test of some kind. Now, interestingly, if you are a musician, and I was and am, but went through the board exams, it's worth reminding ourselves that those are a mixture of theory and practice. They're a mixture of things that you've practiced and got good at, and things that you have to have a go at unseen. And they're deliberately tailored to the level that you've reached, and you take them when you're ready. So there's another quite curious potential development we could think about here, which is, why on earth do we only have exams at one time of the year? Are we really so set on that? Or would it be possible, and one of the members of our group, Mary Cook, was suggesting recently that she used to run UCAS, the body that looks after the transition from school to university. Mm-hmm. And she was saying, well, why couldn't we have a kind of great bank of problems or questions that you do when you're ready? So you don't have to just wait for the English language test on June the 7th in 2021. You do it when you're ready. And that seems to be a really interesting idea. The final bit of actually two more, if you recognize the importance of things like character, so my ability to be resilient, my ability to be kind and thoughtful, my ability to collaborate with others, then you might want some means of scoring or recognizing that. In the States, the KIPP charter schools have made terrific progress in this regard. And there are a number of other initiatives, sometimes based on or around the work of positive psychologist Martin Seligman, other times around the work of educational researcher Angela Duckworth. But all really well grounded. And of course, they beg the question, do we want to measure everything? No, I don't think we do. But do we want to start to track the development of some of the things that we've historically not mentioned and counted? I think we probably do. And finally, just to kind of round this off, PISA, we touched on this earlier on. Every 3 years, PISA measures English, maths and science across the developed world, all those OECD member countries who want to be part of that. But every 3 years also, they, since 2015, have tried to measure something else. So, for example, in 2015, they looked at creative problem solving, or collaborative problem solving, I think it was called. And in 2021, although it'll actually be 2022 now because of the interruption of the pandemic, we'll be looking at creative thinking. And I say we because it's been my privilege to work with the OECD for the last 3-4 years. We have a very well-developed model of creativity at the Centre for Real World Learning. And that was part of the initial persuasion or confidence building necessary for the PISA board to decide that creative thinking would be the focus of a new test in what they call the innovative domain in 2021. And interestingly, this will deliberately look not just at written, but also visual expression of creativity. Mm-hmm. It'll deliberately locate some of the creative activity in maths or science, and also in what you might call my world of real world learning, common sense. Because if you just locate a test of creativity in one area, it can so easily become a test of that area rather than a test of creative thinking. And the two things I've learned a lot, but two things that really stick in my mind in developing these tests are that you need to start with really powerful, good questions to which students can answer at multiple levels. So you don't start with a question to which there's a binary yes/no answer. You ask a question which might be, I don't know, about some aspect of sustainable development or some aspect of human behavior, where you can encourage young people to value the process of their thinking as well as the outcomes of their thinking. And the second thing is that wherever possible, it really helps if you locate these tests in real life situations, in scenario, so that they have some meaning for kids.
Well, exactly. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that actually, thinking about schools and thinking about the gulf between, what is wanted on the outside, from employers, or what is needed by industry, or what is, needed by society, that because that's just something that is being increasingly dictated to us. Or, society is begging for, people are on sustainability and environmentalism and these kind of things. But if you were going to give advice to a parent, for example, whose child was going to transition from, top end of primary school, going into a secondary school, and they're thinking, well, I like these things that you're talking about here, and I want the best for my child. And what kind of advice would you give them, for a parent whose child is going into a sort of very traditional school, which doesn't necessarily value the same things that you value?
Choose a different school.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's valid as anything out there.
We should remember that in most areas of the country, there is some choice at secondary. Not all areas, because geography means that that may not be practically possible for you. If I'm thinking from, and I've been through this transition myself as a parent, if you're not happy, then you've kind of got two different routes. One is if you're the kind of parent who's prepared to engage with the school community, then there's an advocacy role you could have there. And if you're not, which I guess most people aren't, then there's a temporary measure you can take with your children, or increasingly young people, your adolescents, your soon-to-be teenagers, and that is to make the other things that your youngster does in his or her life so thrilling and exciting, that they're beginning to get some real joy from that, as well as in school, and that gradually these two worlds kind of meet. Because I've noticed as my own family's grown up, that something that may start out as an interest then becomes a shared interest, and then at secondary school, young people are perfectly capable to organize themselves around doing something, whether it's learning a musical instrument and then making music together, or skateboarding, or some aspect of service, or being part of Explorer Scouts, or whatever it is. So we shouldn't underestimate young people's ability to take a bit of control of their lives. And also, we shouldn't underestimate the informal learning that takes place as in kind of the wraparound school. But the real fundamental answer to your question is that I think there's a job of work to be done. It's mainly at secondary, what I'm saying now. There are some absolutely brilliant secondary schools, and many of my friends happen to be in them, or running them, or part of the movement for a more expansive kind of education. But there are some schools which have become somewhat cowed by what it is they perceive they're required to do by Ofsted and by the Department for Education. And to my friends in that category, I'd say, be bold, because it's a myth that if you do some of this other stuff, your results will suffer. And I think this is a really important intellectual part of the argument. So we know from the work of people who are much fated, like John Hattie, whose work is widely used by the teaching profession. And also we know from the Education Endowment Foundation and their toolkit, that the kind of teaching and learning methods that are more expansive, that will lead to the development of metacognition, of more creative ways of being and thinking, they also, when delivered well, will improve the exam result. So it's kind of a win-win. And the person who I think has given most thought to this in his life is my friend and colleague Guy Claxton, and his work on building learning power. Guy and I have written quite a lot about this, and we've written something together called Educating Ruby, what our children really need to learn, where we lay out a kind of roadmap for what we think this parallel curriculum is, and we point to some fantastic, promising examples of this in practice. So there are schools that are doing this, lots of them, not enough yet.
It's nice to hear some of the optimism coming from people who are involved in rethinking assessment. I think that's one thing that I've picked up from yourself and Ollie Newton and Al McConville, is really that sense of optimism. Not that there's not work to be done, of course, there's lots of work to be done, but also, and that idea that there is a movement of people, and people can join that movement if they so wish.
It is a really powerful idea, and you're right, I am an optimist. And if I sounded in critical mode about what wasn't right, I hope that anybody watching this would see that's not me. I'm scanning the world to find promising practices, and rethinking assessment is all about finding different ways of doing this so that we can value the whole range of young people's talents.
Perfect. Well, thanks very much, Bill. I really appreciate taking the time, and thanks very much for talking to me.